18 months ago, I released the first ever video on this channel where I ranked every single Eurovision national final of 2023. A lot has changed in the 2 editions since then, so it's time to look back and do it again. I genuinely find it strange to look back at this guy now with the blurry camera, wonky microphone, holes in the walls, crap all over the table in the background, and headphones in for some reason. Not to mention the dodgy thumbnail. This is how I and the exact same backdrop look now. Sadly, not all of today's national selections have had the same glow up. Just like last time, we're going to do this in the form of a tier list. There is absolutely loads to get through, so we're going to just get on with it. Very quickly before we do, make sure to like the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel as well if you enjoy it, and my socials as well as details on how to support me financially are in the description. Just as a side note, I'm not including selections that were cancelled partway through or that selected an artist but not a song. To qualify for this video, you have to select an artist and a song at the same time.
My Shayla.
We're starting this time around with Croatia. This national final did terribly in my ranking video last time, and to be honest, we haven't come on all that far since then. Last year's success was basically by accident, given that they originally didn't even put Baby Lasagna in the national final, and he only got subbed in because somebody else withdrew. Luckily, since last year, the level musically has improved a little bit, even if that is coming from quite a low base. Sadly, you are still looking at a field that was mostly absent of clear candidates for qualification to the final in May. Marco Bośniak, who won this show, in my opinion, was not one of those candidates, and I think it spells bad news for the country too. It would be harsh to put this right at the bottom, given that it wasn't a terrible show and didn't make you feel like you had to suffer through it, quite in the same way that other editions of this have done in recent years. That said, it's still far from strong enough to push it any higher than that. For today, it's going to be D tier, an improvement on 2023, but not by much. Next up is Luxembourg, and that's the Luxembourg Song Contest. This was one of the strangest national finals this year, mostly because of the way it seemed to deal only in extremes. The production was expensive and technical, and would have been fitting for a genuine big-ticket national selection. But the song quality was among the worst of any national final anywhere in Europe this season. The Luxembourgish broadcaster, perhaps unsurprisingly, received a lot less applications for the selection than it did last year. There's 2 main reasons for this. The first is that the way the process was conducted last year, which took a lot of people's songs away from them and replaced them with songs written especially for the competition, alienated a lot of the local music industry. The second, and to be honest, probably main reason is just that this isn't Luxembourg's first year back anymore. Because of that, the hype was always going to die down a little bit. Despite that, though, the selection really should not have been this bad. At best, the songs in this selection were generic and inoffensive. And at worst, there were some genuine disasters, including not 1 but 2 generic dude bands, neither of which could sing. The production is the saving grace here, and to be fair to the winner, Laura Thorne, her song was very clearly the best of this bunch, as well as the only one with any kind of potential to get somewhere in Basel in May. On those bases, this has just enough redeeming factors to carry it up to C tier, but only by the skin of its teeth. Ukraine is the next one we're going to be talking about, and their national final, Vidbir. Given the way this video has started with a little bit of negativity, I think it's good to break it up with a national final that I'm pretty much positive about on every single front. The big hurdle that I wanted to see overcome this year was production quality. This has understandably been compromised in less than ideal conditions in the last 2 years. The natural complication of organising a national final during a foreign invasion is that you can't just set it up in the normal way. We've seen this pre-recorded and we've seen it hosted in a train station since 2022. That makes it all the more impressive that this year the production was so much better. And as well as that, we were delivered one of the strongest lineups of songs and artists as well. There are probably 4 or 5 songs at least here that would have made really great Eurovision entries. And even the wildcard round for this selection provided a lot of entertainment. That spanned from the cult following that Grisana picked up during that process to the slightly questionable lyrics of the song Anymore by Ranrawi. Given the quality of the songs and the production and of the show as a whole, I do have the time here to focus on some of the slightly smaller and less significant gripes with this selection. Chief among those is the voting system. You have a small panel of jurors awarding scores from 1 through to 11, and then the public does the same. I really hate it when points aren't awarded proportionally but are instead done in this flat system. It takes away the ability of the public, or the juries for that matter, to express a really strong preference for any one song, while simultaneously enabling the jury to essentially disallow most of the selection from a chance of winning before the public have even voted. There's no such thing as a perfect 50-50 split system between the juries and the public, but this is absolutely the wrong one. In general, though, that is a secondary concern for this show at the moment. That's because everything else is being done right here. As a result, it's delivered the latest in an incredible series of entries, and in the most logistically difficult difficult situation for any national final to be in, they continue to keep bringing top quality. For all of those reasons, I'm actually going to push this up from last time I did this tier list. This is now going into S tier, and it's not going to be the last show that goes in that tier either, so make sure to stay with me. Unfortunately, I don't share the same optimism about the next show as I did the last one, and that's Spain. Once again renewing the format Benidorm Fest for their selection this year. To be honest, I don't really know where to start with this one. It has not been a good couple of years. I was so excited about where this show was going when I made this video the first time around, and in 2023, we were coming off the back of a Blanca Paloma robbery that came out of, in my opinion, a strong show that was going places. In the time since then, we have watched everything fall apart. The production quality seems to have suddenly dropped off a cliff, and for that matter, so has the quality of the live performances. Obviously, we already had the Fusa Nocta nightmare in 2023, but in-tune performances have been at a serious premium in the 2 editions since. The huge fall in song quality as well has been so depressing to watch. Sadly, 2025 was the worst year yet for this, and the decline was so alarming that it got a full video on this channel. As I said there, Spain deserves so much better than this, and when it comes to the huge resources that all of the Big 5 broadcasters have, there's really no excuse for producing a show and a winner of such poor quality. They're not the last Big 5 broadcaster that's going to get some flack in this video for that exact reason. Benidorm Fest is going badly wrong. And as a result, we need an urgent shift in creative direction as soon as possible. It has completely lost its ability to produce competitive packages for Eurovision. And unless there's a shift soon, we're going to see another decade of Spain being condemned to the bottom of the leaderboard. For all of those reasons, this is dropping down to D tier. The only person who deserved better was Melomana, who still managed to do great despite the fact that everything around her was a complete disaster. Next up is Malta, with their show the Malta Eurovision Song Contest. Malta has not exactly had the best time in Eurovision recently. We've now seen 2 last place finishes in 2 years, which by the way were both absolutely not deserved, but nevertheless over the same period it feels like the selection has improved somewhat. The big difference for me this year was the return of the live arena with an audience, over last year's weird tiny closed studio thing. More importantly than that, they finally reduced the number of participants in the show. Last year there were 36 entrants. This is on an island of 600,000 people. Those 36 acts were split across 4 different semi-finals. The show was just too big. This year, we've slimmed it down to 2 semi-finals with 24 acts and all happening in 1 week instead of being spread over months. This made the whole show so much more coherent and way easier to follow. And it cut out a lot of unnecessary songs that really were space fillers and didn't need to be there anyway. That said though, for the songs that were still in this show, in general, the level was not life-changing. It wasn't that they were particularly bad. It's just that basically everywhere you turned, there was another generic pop song. Luckily, we did have some standouts too, in the form of Miriana Conte, of course, as well as Christy Spiteri and Pantera. In my opinion, all 3 of those would have had a solid chance of qualifying. Unfortunately, it took us hours to get through the whole thing because there were so many ad breaks. I saw the same Maltese government ads about changing tax brackets about 47 times. In all seriousness, while this show will ultimately be remembered this year for 1 song and 1 song alone, it overall took some really clear steps forward, and I'm excited for what could be offered in the future. Hopefully that future will include Matt Black.
It's Matt Black.
For now, this is scraping into B tier. I'm being a little generous on that, but given the limited resources that the broadcaster have and the size of Malta as a country, I thought that this was a really impressive effort. Just seriously, please reduce the ad breaks. Next up is a national final I actually attended this year, and that's Irish Eurosong. While song quality improved for the 2nd straight year, there's one key thing which is going to keep this low down in the rankings. That's the fact that the studio they host this national final in is totally inappropriate for this kind of broadcast. As a result, basically every artist sounds terrible on TV every year. It's hard enough to get established artists to participate in this thing anyway, and you're just making it way harder for yourself by putting forward a show that's going to make them sound bad. I will say that the in-person experience at this one is very good. The artists do sound much better in the room, and it does help too that the Irish broadcaster give you loads of free wine before and send you away with a self-tanning gift bag at the end. You can find out more about all of that in my video on this channel about my whole experience there. Focusing back on the songs though, there were some genuine exciting options here. Bobby Arlo was my favourite and the general favourite among fans as well, but there was also potential in Realtor and Niall as well. In addition to that, we did get a winner which is in contention to qualify in the form of Emmy. That's 4 of the 6 songs in the selection, and that's a pretty good hit rate. by Irish standards. I do hope that me excluding Samantha Mumba from a list of actually viable packages for Eurovision won't result in a similar reaction to how she responded to the Eurosong jury not liking her song very much. That was by taking to Instagram to say that they should suck a bag of dicks. We are now at a point where this selection could deliver songs of sufficient quality for a full-blown Irish Song Festival once again. That needs to be in a proper venue that's designed to put on a show of this style. I really hope that RTE, the broadcaster, will cough up the money to do that in future, because that is the next step in Ireland's renaissance in the contest. Until then, I really can't put this any higher than C tier. I have a soft spot for it, but the show just isn't good enough. Speaking of not good enough, let's talk about Germany and their show Chefsache ESC. This is one of the worst formats of any national final I think I've ever seen. Seriously, they need to lock this one away in a cupboard and never let it out ever again. You came into this national final with a series of ridiculous proclamations from the broadcaster that winning Eurovision was their goal and that the format wouldn't be renewed if they didn't achieve that. Safe to say, this format is being scrapped, because there was never a prospect of this generating a Eurovision winner. We started off with heats, where all the artists performed cover songs. A jury consisting of Stefan Raab and his mates then decided who went through to the semi-finals. If you were knocked out at this stage, you never even had a chance to perform your Eurovision entry. You were sent home having done one cover on live TV with your song still in the can. Then at the semi-final stage, when artists actually got to perform the songs they were submitting for the contest, there was still no public vote. And again, Stefan Raab and his mates decided who went to the final. The promise here was that the final decision would be for the public and that the final of the show would be 100% public vote. Unfortunately, before we got to that, the jury decided to eliminate another 4 of the 9 finalists and leave only 5 for the public to choose from. The most controversial of these eliminations was the band Feuerschwanz, who were considered a fan favourite before the show. This whole thing was Stefan Raab's baby, and unfortunately all it has done is demonstrate in a Eurovision context what was already clear in a German domestic context. His ratings are declining, the public are losing interest in him, he doesn't understand the assignment so well anymore, and his time has passed. He only confirmed this himself during the show when he said that melancholy songs and ballads do better at Eurovision because 60% of voters are women and women prefer that kind of music. Stefan Raab is stuck in the past, and Germany at the contest are up shit creek without a paddle. This format made no sense, it wasted a bunch of artists' time, and it didn't even have that great of a production anyway. Plus, once again, every show was about 12 hours long. Getting through this final, where the artists were once again forced to do a second cover song in addition to their Eurovision entry, was a nightmare and one of the most difficult things I had to do this entire season. It's honestly sheer dumb luck that they ended up with a decent entry at the end of this in the form of Abor and Tinner. But this format must die, and it must never come back. They could have run 3 shows with 2 semi-finals of 12 and a grand final, much in the same way that Malta did, actually, involved the public from the start and not made the entire thing seem contrived to ensure that certain artists never had a chance of being in contention. Instead, they chose to do whatever this is. I'm putting this in D tier, and Stefan can thank Abor and Tinner for narrowly keeping this out of F. From Germany onto Serbia and their show Pesma Evroviziju. I made a full video about this one as well because of just how much of a mess it was this year. This went from one of the best and one of my most anticipated shows to one of the biggest disappointments in such a short time. Like I said, there are a video full of reasons why, and everything I say in that video about the political context naturally factors into my decision. That's because it was such a big and unavoidable part of the show this year. Unfortunately, when you compare it to last year though, even just taking the production itself in isolation, everything was worse. The songs were worse, the live performances were worse, the sound engineering was worse, the interval acts were worse because they were all just replays of old interval acts, or montages because all of the actual intervals had withdrawn. Almost every single artist was so outraged by the conduct of the broadcaster more generally, and at the political situation in Serbia, that they used the show to stage some kind of protest, and a bunch of them tried to withdraw beforehand and only couldn't because the penalties in the contract were too great. Combine all of that with a nothing burger winner with little to no potential on the Eurovision stage, and you end up with a pretty big mess. It's such a shame because for the last few years, this had been one of the very best national finals. It's only the unique circumstances and the likelihood of it bouncing back in future that's keeping it out of F tier here. Just like Germany, it's going into D. Hopefully this show will find its stride again next year in very different circumstances. Belgium's Eurosong is next, and this is one of the stranger beasts of national final season, given that it only happens every other year. This is because Belgium has a really unique arrangement where a Flemish broadcaster has responsibility one year, they host this national final, and a Walloon broadcaster takes responsibility the other year, and they tend to focus on internal selection. The good news here is that this seems to be in a really strong place as a selection overall. And the biggest strength was the songs themselves, which naturally is a pretty good place to be in. There are several that I would have been happy to see go to Eurovision. Red Sebastian was naturally a great winner, even though that song hasn't quite clicked with me yet. And I was also very fond of Mentissa, who gave us one of the single catchiest hooks of the entire Eurovision season. I also appreciated the format for giving the songs a chance to grow and live and exist in the public for a little bit before the final. They did this with live showcases, which were pre-recorded events shown on TV in the couple of weeks before the live show. This helped introduce the artist, put forward a solid live performance with the benefit of mixing after the fact, and just lifted some of the pressure that comes with this kind of experience. I also appreciate the fact that they chose a studio over an arena for this national final. Usually I wouldn't say that because, as we've seen with Ireland, it can backfire. But the Flemish broadcaster seems to really know what it's doing with this specific studio, because all of the sound mixing sounded pretty good. In general, it felt like they never bit off more than they could chew, and as a result, you got a show that was pretty well polished. I also think it's really sweet that during the results, all of the artists sit together on a couple of big sofas and support each other. Overall, the key word here is solid. Everything is done in a slick way. While there might not be anything that is super adventurous, it's entertaining and it's reliable, and for that reason, I'm going to put it into B tier. We're now going to another national final I attended. This time, it's Eesti Laul. Again, you can watch a full video about this show on my YouTube channel if you fancy it. This show punches above its weight, both in terms of its reputation and its quality for such a small country. This year, I thought there were some things that worked really well, but there were also some things that didn't work at all. I'll start with the good, which is that there are a variety of genres here, and while I did see some comments suggesting that the quality was a little bit low in comparison to usual, I actually didn't really agree with this. There's always going to be bias seeing that I saw all of these performances live, but I actually really enjoyed this field of songs. I also appreciated the broadcaster's ambition in moving this show back into the biggest arena in Estonia with a capacity of around 10,000. As well as that, they brought in more sophisticated staging equipment, LEDs and such like, which shows the desire to grow this show and to improve the production's quality. Unfortunately, I think this might have been a case of biting off more than you can chew. Because there were 16 songs in the final of this, there was precious little time for each act to rehearse on stage. More crucially, that meant the production team didn't have much time to get the camera angles right either. As a result, we had a show littered with production errors. Those aforementioned camera angles were often terrible, and some of the vocals were not so polished either. That said, artists naturally bear some responsibility for that too. What that left us with was a show that was enjoyable, but just a little too rough around the edges. There were countless examples of these kinds of little mishaps all throughout the show, including ones that weren't visible on screen. A couple of those included a campfire on stage that couldn't be put out with a blanket like originally planned, so they had to use a fire extinguisher instead. There was also a massive scaffolding used for one staging that was too tall to be brought onto the stage in one piece. That meant it had to be assembled for a great length of time on stage, and one bit of the scaffolding was wonky, so one of the stagehands had to kick it into place every time they built it. All this means is, it would have been great to see what this show could have done with the same amount of time and half the amount of songs. We would not have lost much by having this show being 8 songs instead of 16. I really hope they stay ambitious, and I hope they don't leave this arena in future years. But we have to have less songs and more polish. For now, it's going into B tier because it was still strong, but there is a lot to fix here. Now we're moving on to Slovenia, which returned their national final EMA after a few years off. This had another slightly odd voting system, where the first round was 100% juries, and then the top 2 with the jury were put to the public for a straight choice. 2-song superfinals are always a bad idea because they start to cause something called anti-voting, where essentially people start voting for one act because they dislike the other one. If you have 3 songs in a superfinal, this effect is greatly reduced. So that's one quick easy fix that they should implement straight away. In general, I don't really like the idea of taking away most of the public's choices before they've even had a chance to pick up the phone. There were all these other songs which deserved recognition from the public but got none of it because of the way they set this up. Other than that, I find it pretty difficult to have any strong feelings about the show just because most of it was so mid. I was really gutted to not see July Jones go to Eurovision, but I understand why Clement won on the basis that he's so famous and popular domestically in Slovenia. I also really hope that July is going to try again in a future year. As for the rest of the show, I found it pretty uninspiring. In the absence of any strong feelings, I'm just going to put this in C tier. I don't love it, I don't hate it, it's just fine. But seriously, fix that voting system. Latvia is next, and what Supernova brought us this year was one of the craziest results of the entire national final season. There was a three-way tie at the top of the leaderboards, with another song 1 point behind that also won the public vote. This is obviously an exciting result, but it also shows why the 2 sets of 1 through 12 point system that they use here is totally inappropriate for this kind of contest. For those of you who aren't familiar, there is a full jury vote and a full public vote. The results of this are then converted into 2 sets of 1 through to 12 points, just like at Eurovision, and added together to get the final score. In the event of a tie, the public breaks it. The problem with this system is that the jury's points are always revealed first, sometimes before the public vote has closed, in such a way that it disallows basically all but the top 3 or 4 songs from having any chance whatsoever of winning the show. It also doesn't allow the public, or the jury for that matter, to express any strength of feeling over a song. If 50 or 60% of the public vote for a song, then that song should receive 50 to 60% of the public vote points. Ultimately, this is a song that represents a country, and if that country is expressing an overwhelming preference, the voting system should allow for that preference to be recognized. All of that is a shame because this is one of the strongest lineups I've seen in Supernova in years. The winner was really great, even if I think it might not have very much appeal at Eurovision, and it had 3 songs right behind it that also would have made excellent representatives as well. For those reasons, despite that voting system, I am still going to put it into B tier. Hopefully the show can keep developing and moving forward because it's going in the right direction. But I just really hope they abolish that stupid voting system. Another show with that exact same voting system is Portugal, Festival de Canção. If there was an award for the show that terrorized Eurofans the most this year, I think Festival de Canção would be on the shortlist to win it. That's because Tristeza by Josh was considered not just one of the favourites to win this selection, but a potential high-end contender at Eurovision as well. But in the end, he scraped through to the final on a tiebreaker before finishing 4th with the public and 6th with the jury in the final. Another shock was Henke getting a flat 0 from the juries only to go on and win the televote. If the points had been given out proportionally, because of the volume of televotes that Henke had, she would have won the whole show. I know this video isn't the place for me to be airing all of my, oh, this song was robbed gripes, but the jury completely flattened the public vote's favourite before they even had a chance to pick up the phone. In addition to that, not for the first time, the regional juries for each part of Portugal that are used in this selection keep showing favoritism to acts that are from their own region. Quite frankly, if you can't trust the juries to vote fairly, and I don't think they're voting fairly at present, then you shouldn't have them in the show at all. Luckily for Portugal, there is a big saving grace here, which is that the song quality is really, really high. That's in no small part down to the fact that this show is so unapologetic about how directly catered for the domestic audience it is. Choosing a Eurovision entry is almost a secondary part of the process. What that results in is a show that's really high quality and really authentic, and that means more than anything else. This one is going to be in B tier just on the basis that the voting system is clearly broken right now. But had they fixed that up, this probably would have been an A tier. That's how good it is. Maybe in a year or two, when I inevitably do this video again, something will have changed. Next up is Denmark with their version of Melodi Grand Prix. Denmark is a country that really can't seem to catch a break in Eurovision. They have not qualified once this decade, which is particularly inexcusable when you consider that Sweden is next door. They are literally a bridge away. The problem here is that you have all of the blandness of Melodifestivalen, but with a lower quality. That leads to a show that's more generic, more disappointing, and without the potential to produce hits in the same way that Melodifestivalen can. That takes away a big draw for the most prominent Danish songwriters and Danish music professionals. That said, at the very least, some of this show was listenable. I also want to shout out ESC Factful, among others, because they had Eurovision creators, including her, on their jury this year. On the basis that we've ended up with an entry that does have potential to qualify this year, and the fact that Denmark are doggedly dragging themselves forward despite continued miserable failure, I'm going to put this into C tier, but to be honest, I think I'm being quite generous. I'm also going to go a little softly on the next one as well, which is Montesong from Montenegro. This is another one that I did a full video on, and it says a lot that was called How Not to Select a Eurovision Entry. There were so few submissions to this show that they took half of them and put them into the actual broadcast. In addition, we had the winner withdrawing because they performed their song in public before September the 1st, and the production level was, broadly speaking, a potato. That said, because it's their first year back and going straight in with a national final like this that's clearly meant to be a longer term project was really ambitious, I'm going to give them a bit of a pass, and I'm going to try and finish this off in a hopeful way. We did end up with a good Eurovision entrant in Nina Žižić, even if it took a while and a bit of wrangling to get there, and we got some great memes out of it like Dolce Hera. In all seriousness, I really appreciated the sincerity with which this project was carried out, especially with a budget of about 10p, and given the circumstances, it's genuinely a credit that they managed to get a show on at all. I can't put this any higher than D tier because there was simply so much wrong with it. I do not mean any disrespect with that. I'm really hopeful to see this show take some steps forward in future. Now it's Norwegian Melodi Grand Prix, and this unfortunately is another show that took a sharp downturn this year. I am genuinely curious as to what happened because for whatever reason, the quality of the songs just dropped off a cliff. This is despite the fact that the show was smaller than last year. Most of these would have been non-starters at other national finals, and when you combine that with 2 last-minute withdrawals, you ended up with a bit of a mess. Luckily for Norway, the production is always slick, and that didn't change. In addition, Kyle Alessandro was so polished and put together a really great show. They should be counting their lucky stars that they had him. Beyond that, there was alarmingly little depth in here. The only other vaguely viable package for Eurovision was Run to the Hills. Run to the hills, I'm making it on my own. Sorry, no, I meant Queen of Kings. Sorry, no, I meant The Game by Natalie. She was a great vocalist, but the staging didn't suit the song at all, and she was extremely stiff. Every national final has bad years, and because this has the underlying infrastructure to keep it going, it will certainly bounce back. But for this year, it's clinging on to the very bottom of B tier on that underlying infrastructure alone. It has to be better next time. Sweden is next, another one that got a video on this channel that you can watch later if you like, and arguably the most prestigious national selection of all. Alongside Italy, it is in a totally different league. That prestige is there for a reason, and this is both the best produced and most smoothly executed national final pretty much every year. Nobody does it like the Swedes on this front. That said, a lot of my concerns that I had last time out still remain now. That includes the fact we're still relying on a tiny clique of songwriters writing for a pretty small group of artists as well. That means we're hearing the same things over and over again, and it's just really frustrating. With that in mind though, I think Kai's victory this year is really refreshing and shows that this show does have the potential to evolve. Melfest wouldn't be Melfest without at least some solid pop, but this shows you can do some slightly more different things as well and still have success. There is plenty of room for far more diversity in this show, and if anyone can pull off a big risk musically, it's Sweden. Overall, I'm going to keep this in A tier rather than in S tier just because of that repetitiveness. You cannot deny the quality, but I'm still hearing the same things over and over again. It's Armenia's national selection now, and that means we're going from one of the very best to possibly the very worst. Armenia's national selection this year was diabolically terrible in just about every single possible way. The production was horrific, and in turn this led to every song sounding absolutely terrible, though some were worse than others. The song quality here was mostly equally awful, and as a result you had a truly painful watching experience, with the icing on the cake being provided by the sheer volume of utterly terrible lyrics. I don't know how someone would sit down and write "put some dedication, motivation, no negotiation, daquination" and think, yeah, that's great, we'll go with that. Then of course we have the absolute gem from the winner of the show. I'm a survivor. Stay alive. 2 years ago, there were very limited times when I suggested that a national final should be cancelled, but this one needs to die. This is F tier, it needs to go away for a few years, and they need to actually learn how to produce it. As I said, F tier, complete disaster. Next up is Poland, which was, to be honest, a really nice surprise. After a year off, this show has improved in pretty much every single respect. You have better songs, we're in a better venue, the sound engineering and production is much better, and you no longer have the almost certainly corrupt juries, instead favouring a 100% public vote. In addition to that, you had some really nice genre diversity in this show too. You had more conventional pop, of course, but it sat along some slightly braver stuff. And those brave entries were rewarded with top 5 finishes. Justina, having such a big fan base beforehand, naturally made it very likely that she was going to win. But Gaia is clearly a deserving winner of this show and will make an excellent Eurovision entry. I will say on purely petty ground, I'm pretty aggrieved that one of my personal favourites came last and only got 647 votes. But then again, my other 2 favourites were first and second, so I can't complain too much. I can hardly believe I'm saying this, but based on this year's showing, this is going into my A tier. Well done, Poland, and thank you for genuinely a really, really nice surprise. Söngvakeppnin from Iceland is next. And the biggest strength of this show was its ultimate winners in the form of Vibe. They've got an extremely catchy song and bags of charisma on stage. The main problem is, once you get away from them, we are pretty rapidly running out of road. There are basically no other packages in this show that I would have felt comfortable going to Eurovision. That speaks to a more general concerning fall in quality in this show over the last few years. Iceland is always going to be limited by the fact that the country is just so small. But at the same time, I do think this maybe needs some revisiting. There just isn't enough quality coming into the national selection in the first place. This is more than watchable, but there are still lots to improve. So for now, I'm going to put it into C tier. Greece is next, and I've just about forgiven them now for making me wait 40 minutes into this show before we even heard a single song, as well as making me sit through yet another rendition of Waterloo by ABBA. Unfortunately though, that opening kind of set the tone for the selection. This venue was not at all suited to a show of this style, and the audience shots that kept showing empty seats didn't do much good either. We then got a selection of songs that, to be honest, didn't feel very suited to the contest. The exception to that was Barb's, Evangelia, and Claudia, who did finish in the top 3, and thank God they were there. While I don't think this show was anywhere near as bad as Armenia, and it certainly shouldn't be cancelled, it definitely needs a rethink for next year. There would be no shame in scaling this down into a smaller studio, and using the money that frees up for improvements in other areas. At the moment, probably partly because this was the first year back of having a national selection for Greece, it was just too much of a mess. We did get a good entry out of this, but the show was not good, so for that reason, I'm going to put it into D tier. Next, we're going to talk about Lithuania. This is one of the most interesting selections to me, and it's also one of the strongest in terms of songs. It's also the only national selection that ended up with me being mentioned on the national news of the country in question.
Dariau interviu, pokalbį, podcastą su vienu populiariausiu pasaulyje Eurovizijos YouTuberiu ESC Gabe.
There's a lot that Lithuania gets right in this selection, but also a lot they get wrong. The first and biggest thing is that this selection has way too many entries. You do not need 45 participants. You could run a show of much better quality with 16, still have 2 semi-finals by just putting 8 in each one, and then having 10 in the final. Instead, we go through this bizarre exercise of having 5 semi-finals, which is the kind of thing you can only get away with if your selection has the prestige and production quality of Melodifestivalen. The thing is that this probably isn't going to change because this selection is delivering really good ratings for the national broadcaster, and that's part of the motivation for dragging it out like this. It doesn't help either that the final of this show was 4 hours long. There is never an excuse for your national final to be this long, doesn't matter how many songs there are in it. Overall, I appreciate the show, and it got a great result again this year, but the structure of it is ridiculous, and for that very petty reason, I'm going to drop it into B tier. Slim it down a bit, and you could be onto a winner. Albania is next, and that means I'm once again going to be dunked on in the comments for saying FIK instead of FIK. This one has a special place in Eurovision fans' hearts because it's usually one of the earliest, if not the earliest, selection of the season. For me, it certainly feels like the moment where we kick off national final season in earnest. That said, it has never really clicked with me all that well. There's been clear steps this year because they changed the creative direction, and now the creative director is Elhaj Dani, who previously represented the country at Eurovision in 2015. In no small part, due to that decision, we leapt forward about 15 years in terms of the style of the songs and the way in which things were being staged. That said, it was still really messy, which is probably symptomatic of moving so fast so soon. As a result, we had dodgy choreo, none more so than the human ladder into trustful combination executed by Elvana Jata, as well as dropped microphones and all the rest. I do also find the 4-night runtime of this show to be a bit of a marathon, and while I appreciate the traditions of this and don't necessarily think this is something that should be changed just because of its cultural importance in Albania, from a Eurovision fan perspective, it makes it a little more difficult to follow. Their idea of a 50-50 jury televote system also didn't really make sense because the jury points added up to 106 and the public vote added up to 150. Looking at what we already have in B tier, unfortunately, I just can't rank this alongside those. For that reason, I'm going to have to push it down into C tier, but I'm excited for what this show might deliver in future. San Marino is next with their newly rebranded San Marino Song Contest. This has had something of a legendary place in Eurovision folklore and also on this channel for the past couple of years. Part of that for me was just how lovable the whole thing was. Amidst a sea of semi-finalists, this year numbering more than 200, you'd occasionally get something as mad and wonderful as Loco Boombox, and that just gave me so much joy. For some reason though, this year I just didn't quite connect with it in the same way. I've come to realize though that was probably just because the quality has gone up quite significantly, and the production and the slickness of the show has improved as well. This didn't feel like a show that would accidentally lose some artists in a shopping centre anymore, and there are a few songs that would have made decent Eurovision entries too. Because of that, I can't put this up at the top of the list anymore because I have to rank it seriously because the show is now good enough that we can start to take it seriously. For that reason, it's going into C tier. At the moment, it's eating up a lot of rejects from other national finals. And while that has elevated the quality to a certain point, I need to see something more before I'm going to be willing to put it any higher. Going next door, we're now going to talk about the Sanremo Music Festival in Italy. It's time for me to admit something. I put this in C in 2023, 25% because I actually believed in that ranking, and 75% because I was just trying to rage bait. My sincere apologies to the many Italians in the comments section of that video who I irritated very much. Sanremo both is and isn't a national selection, and there's a discourse about this every year, so I think it would be great if we all just agreed the wording, Sanremo, the Italian music festival that also serves as the mechanism for Italy to choose its Eurovision entry. All the semantics aside, one thing we can agree on is that it works, and we keep seeing amazing results from Italy as a consequence. I could spend another 5 minutes moaning about the format of this show, about the way the votes are cast, and about the fact it takes them about 5 days to decide anything. But I think with a show like this, I've come to realize you have to just take a step back and say, well, this is tradition. This show has even more tradition and more history than Eurovision does. There's a certain point at which that tradition has to prevail. And for that reason, I've kind of made my peace with it and just accepted that it works and that it's an amazing show with a lot of great songs. I will, however, restate my now regularly brought up opinion that it's not a great look for the entire top 5 to be men. Overall, this is going to go into A tier. I'm only denying it S tier on my own personal gripes. Hopefully, that dramatic promotion will serve as an appropriate apology for last time. We're finishing up with my favorite national final of the year, and once again, that is UMK in Finland. This show did have to deal with some turbulence this year with a sudden withdrawal of one of its entries. But you can hardly blame the show for the band One Morning Left literally disintegrating into nothingness after they were selected. They literally ceased to exist as a band. As for the show more broadly, the level of buy-in that the Finnish music industry now has with UMK is genuinely astounding. At every level, big names are desperate to get into this thing, and most of them are being rejected. Of those who did get in, you have a slew of big names who've delivered massive chart success in recent years, as well as relative risks taken on newcomers like Goldilocks and Nia River. In the case of Nia River, that probably didn't work out, and her live vocal showed that maybe she wasn't ready for this yet. But in the case of Goldilocks, the public got really attached to her. In her case, and in fact in the case of every song in this show, you had massive chart success in Finland. The production took a step up from last year as well. Moving into the Nokia Arena, which is a lot bigger than the previous venue, there was always going to be sound challenges, and they managed to deal with most of them fairly well this time around. In addition, the staging for each participant felt so well thought out, and they brought in one of the best talents on the continent in the form of Sergio Hyen that really helped elevate this show with him as creative director. Every great show needs an incredible winner, and while I did think every one of the acts in this show would have made a great entry with the possible exception of Koste, Erika Vikman was a level above. The image of her rising to the sky atop a giant microphone is going to stay in my mind for a very long time. This has now been my favorite by a clear margin for the last 3 years, and it feels like they're taking all of the right lessons from year to year. It just keeps getting better. This show has gone from nowhere to a national institution in barely half a decade, and for that reason, it richly deserves another S tier ranking. With that, we've now gone through every national selection, and here is what the final tier list looks like. I will leave a link in the description too if you'd like to do this yourself. For now, don't forget to like the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, make sure to check out the rest of my Eurovision 2025 coverage, and I'll see you again very soon.